Welcome to The Secret Witch Show, the podcast providing a safe and alchemical altar space of conversations which help powerful women escape a half-hearted, spiritless society and rediscover the freedom of living a wildly magical life. Every other week, we explore how to cast aside the wounds of shame, guilt, and fear connected with fully being yourself, so you can grant yourself permission to stop hiding, ground soulfully back into your body, illuminate your whole soul desires, tend your soul, rediscover and reclaim your powerful gifts, express your magic, and manifest your wildest alchemy. There's no better place to become who your heart longs to be. This is where we will guide you into liberation. I'm your host, Nicole Barton, and I'm so excited to dive in. Welcome to a magical show, everyone. I am currently in Bali as you're listening to this episode, but I am sharing my journey over in the Secret Witch Sisterhood, which has had a GC rebrand. If you're feeling alone in the journey of becoming a healer and you love the deep work of self-healing, I would love for you to join us over in our Secret Witch Sisterhood. This month, we are going to be exploring the topic of trusting your intuition and healing our self-doubt. So if you'd like to join us, there is a gorgeous community of women in there waiting to welcome you. Just search Secret Witch on Facebook. On to today's show, though. This episode is one with one of my own magical guides. So I will warn you, it does go deep. And it might feel triggering in some places, or it might even take you off into another realm. So I'm just giving you a little prior warning. Anyway, on the Secret Witch Show today, our guest is William Apple. William is the founder of Aion Psychodynamic coaching, and with a passion for understanding the depths of the human psyche and a commitment to personal growth and transformation, William offers a unique approach to coaching and mentoring that transcends traditional life coaching programs. William's most influential teacher and mentor by proxy within the realms of psychology would be Carl Jung. Like Jung, William has found a devotion within himself to explore and create an intimacy with Psyche and her mother, the unconscious. And this intimacy is driven by likewise strict devotion to the child of Logos analysis. All of which likewise led William naturally towards traditional Western alchemy and mysticism, making Carl Jung William's most naturally aligned professor. In this deep and brilliant episode, we explore how to journey with inner child work and shadow work rather than the fantasy of quick fixes for deep healing. We dived into the psychological reasons we tend to favour quick fix approaches to healing, what we mean by real inner child work, and how curiosity, intimacy and self-illumination are key to healing and realising our magic. William shares truthfully at the end that becoming a healer is one of the most challenging callings we can have, showing why healing ourselves is important along the way. Let's dive in. Welcome, William. You are one of my own magical guides. And as I've been working deeply with you recently, it occurred to me that it would be utterly magical to have you with us on the show to share your brilliant and deep wisdom with our Secret Witch listeners who also share a love for the deep work. So I'm really happy that you're here with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
No, it's my absolute pleasure. So I would love to dive in the way that I always do, because ultimately the premise of my entire healing modality is that people's stories are healing for others. I believe that we're all kind of archetypal remedies for other people, and that our stories kind of activate for others' self-illumination. So my first invitation is always to invite guests to share a little bit about their own journey. So I would love particularly to hear, given we're here to talk about real healing inner child work and the role of fantasy, I think you spell it with a PH, don't you?
Yeah.
In your own journey of realising your magic. So maybe let's start there, if that feels good.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So my story, and again, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit, so I'm going to try to do the best I can to summate it and succinctly. My journey really started when I was 14, and I had this I had a lot of stuff going on at home. There was a lot of sort of systemic abuse, and not sort of, there was a lot of systemic abuse. And I'd always been deeply called to spirituality in some way, shape, or form. And at that point in time, and still to this day, I have a deep relationship with Jesus or Christ, the Christ figure. But that was initially sort of the catalyst, and in the sense that I was going through all these things, and I I had this sort of breakdown. I don't need to get into that all that, but due to the systemic abuse, there was a breakdown that occurred for me, and I was deeply, heavily influenced in martial arts at the time. I still sort of consider myself a loose martial artist. Like I gently practice, but I'm not as affluent as I was then. But um, uh, I had a martial arts instructor who was like also a mentor and sort of a surrogate father figure to me, and he was deeply immersed in Christianity, and he was like, you're going through all this stuff. Let's get you in the church. Let's get you involved. Let's get you doing some things, sort of a spiritual way, and building community, because home life is kind of rough, and etc. And so I did that. I got, quote unquote, saved, and did the whole process, and got really deeply invested in the Bible. And I spent like the next year just, I'd go to school, I'd come home, I was reading the Bible. I'd go home, I'd go to school, go read the Bible. That was all I was pretty much doing for a better part of a year. And it really deeply informed a lot of just me. And I found there was an interesting thing of early on, I didn't have the language for it, but I later found out that there's, in the church, there's this notion of like univocality, which is like trying to make the Bible all one voice. But as an early age, at this 15 years or so, I'm reading the Bible and I'm like, there are different stories happening here, and they do not line up well, and there's contradictions and all this stuff. And so then I would focus just on like Jesus' teachings or whatever. Long story short, in that realm is that I uh I sat down one day, I was reading the Bible, and I was just feeling like this turmoil of not having all the like concise answers that I was having questions to as the process of reading. And I would go to pastors and ministers and priests and ask these questions, and deeply involved in trying to really understand and reconcile the conflictions and the contradictions that I was finding. And there was nothing. And so I was deeply seeking answers, and um uh I was reading the Bible, and I put the Bible down, and I remember distinctly I took this Bible and I scooted it, I just pushed it away from me, and it went underneath my bed. And I prayed, and it's probably the hardest I've ever prayed in my life. And I was like, I love this. This is something that deeply calls to me, and I want to know what that truth is to the best of my ability. And I'm praying that however that wants to come to me, please let that be the thing. And there's a lot more that was said. Again, I'm keeping this very succinct. So, so that was sort of my initiation into, I think, what it is that I do today, was in that moment, because what unfolded after that was, well, that evening I had this like ridiculous vision. I won't share all the details to that now, plus it's relatively personal, but I had this deep sort of dream vision that was very sort of esoteric and symbolic and spiritual, and woke up and was just felt different, just felt changed in some way. And then there was a course of 20 some odd years after that of deep immersion into just religion and spirituality of all different kinds. I think I've told you at one point, so right after that, or pretty close after that, I moved to the UK. And while in the UK, I became very excited. And I remember picking up a book, and just before I moved to the UK, and was a book on Celtic Britain. And there was this, I happened to, it was in the library, and I quickly flipped over and saw this picture of a druid, like as they typically, were drawn in the 1700s, something like that. And 1800. And I was like, how was that? That was me, right? I just this weird feeling of like, I've had that experience or something like that. And then we moved to the UK, and then there's like Obod, and back in the 90s, this is the 90s, and so like there's Order of Bards, Ovid, and Druids. There's ADF, all those things, like, well, and specifically with Obod, I was immersed in their work, and deeply got involved into Celtic Reconstructionism and polytheism, and I've studied Vedanta and Taoism, and all through that time period, I was just studying all those things. But then, and I came to know this guy. This is Mara Baba. He's probably like I would say like my prime guru, if you will. Anyway, so all that stuff unfolded during that time period, and there was a lot of other events that happened, but ultimately this led me to 2014 to 17 was this existential crisis period. I had
Mm.
studied, I had worked immersely in mental health. I had worked in in doing counseling and other sorts of things. But then there was this crisis that hit me, and it was a crisis. It was an identity crisis, and it was an existential crisis. My existence was feeling threatened due to a lot of different reasons. And none of what I had studied had really was giving me answers. In fact, it was sort of leading me to deeper into the crisis, because I would try to reflect upon what I was actually experiencing and feeling, trying to relate it to the teachings that I had in some way, shape, or form regarding psychology, spirituality, or any of those things. And all of it would leave me with more whys than answers. And of course, when you're in some sort of spiral situation, you need something to hold on to, or else you just, continue to spiral. And so through my own, what I later discovered was an inability to learn how to have practical and sort of responsible inquiry, questioning of oneself or existence. What I was really doing was ruminating. I was constantly just trying to have answers, and I did not have the internal grounded embodied awareness to hold on to anything while I was questioning, because the questioning all inquiry is like a fire. It's a questioning that burns and breaks apart. But we tend to, in our society, be encouraged to question things because of, our traumas and the way society's set up. And so, but I didn't have that awareness. And so it continued to spiral me to the point where I was suicidal, and I attempted suicide twice. And after that, I was hospitalized. I was hospitalized the second time. And after that, there was a series of events that happened during that time period where I was reading a lot, and there was a few books that I read. One was Brene Brown's Daring Greatly, which I used to recommend on a regular basis, but I recognize it's not necessarily for everybody. Um, but it's all about shame, and I carried so much shame in my body. And I'm going to do a plug here for a second. Anybody who's wanting to look at the concept of shame and like directly work with that on a regular basis, I highly recommend David Bedrick's work. And again, I'll say that as David Bedrick. He does this whole program on unshaming, and he's a dear friend, and he's just phenomenal. But so, anyways, so that book was all about shame, and I had this experience while I'm in the hospital. I'm reading the book, and like literally every page I'm just like sobbing. I'm like, that's so true. Just and just this cathartic release. And then I also read The Body Keeps the Score by Van der Kolk, he's kind of the guy that discovered PTSD. And anyway, so I read that, and and just really felt informed on a lot of different things. And then I got out of the hospital and started recovering and doing therapy and healing and doing some healing journey. And there was two things that really stood out and sort of anchored me into where I am today, which is I wouldn't say I discovered Carl Jung years before, but the way he's not a great writer. I'm never like apologetic about that. He's just not a great writer. And he's also very heady. He's very clinical. He's very intellectual. And so, when I was reading years ago, I was like, there's something here. I want to know this guy, but I just can't. I don't have the capacity for it now. But then after the crisis period, it was like reading a first language. It was like suddenly I could pick it up and be like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. And it was very easy for me to read. So I started studying Jung's work, and within a 2-year period, I had read pretty much everything he had written. And then I hadn't gotten into the letters until later, like all the letters that he had written back and forth, because there's an archive of that. I finally finished all those. But so I read Jung, and then I was also, hold on, I lost my train of thought. I read Jung, and then I read Jung. Oh, and then I was doing therapy, and had therapists at the time that He was brilliant. I really love him, and do because of the fact that I worked with him. I'm not going to share his name, but he's brilliant. He's here in the area, and I love him very much. I'm so grateful for him. But at the end of it, he was like, because we're getting done, he was like, dude, this is great. You've done a great job, and it seems like you're really sort of anchoring into some sort of new sense of self identity. He's like, what are you going to do? And at the time, to make money ends meet, one of the things I outside of mental health, I always ran restaurants, or I was a cook or something like that. And I was like, well, I'll probably just, I've got a buddy of mine, he's running this restaurant, and I'll probably just keep doing that. And we enjoy hanging out with each other. And he's like, I would like to encourage you to do this work. Could you like go get a degree in psychology or do something, do this thing? Because I think there's something there. And I'd always wanted to do it one-on-one and privately. I'd always pretty much the only mental health work that I'd ever really done, or like working with people one-on-one, was in residential or in group, work, counseling in that way. And I always thought I had a knack for it, or that I had a calling to it, if you will. But so that led to this, which is that, combined with Jung, and then stumbling, if you will, headfirst into alchemy and the occult, combined with all the other spiritual knowledge that I had gained over the years, and Gnosticism and all the things, and then combined with like deep psychology and like psychoanalysis and analytical psychology and the esoteric realms of psychology, combined with the spiritual, I found that there was a love language between the two, between spirituality and deep psychology and alchemy. And so yeah, that culminated into me finally being, what, I've got something here that I want to do. And during the initial year and a half of me working one-on-one with people, there was two things I discovered two things, which is one, that the way we typically talk about inner child work and shadow work is not the way that Jung intended it to. Well, and Jung never really talked about inner child work, but eventually towards the later part of his work, he starts talking about the child, and that this is where, like, I think I've shared this with you, but there's a quote from him about childhood development, and he says the greatest atrocity that a parent can give their child is their unlived life. And so so you start to see later in his later sort of more esoteric work, the inner child, as I frame it, to come to life. He just never named it that way. And then realizing a distinction that inner child work is sort of the introduction to shadow work, and that shadow work is something far different than than one has kind of been appropriated, and I would say bastardized. And I say that lovingly, but that's the sort of the best way to say that in today's world. And that has become the summation of what it is that I do, and sort of what I live and breathe, and all those things. And I think that's a pretty good summation of how I got here. So I'll leave it.
That's amazing. No,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. And yeah, there are a few things. I've got a whole page here of notes to dive into.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so much in that story that I related to. One of the first things that I loved is before we pressed record, we talked about archetypal clear quartz, or silica being your medicine, and
Right.
they're kind of almost like the shadow or the wounding of that particular remedy, as I see it, is that kind of sense of like being so like immersed in logic. So this is just a side point, really. It's not
Sure. Sure.
the thing, but I thought I'd just share it because it was beautiful. In how you shared your story, and there was like so much kind of almost like the word I wrote down was logic, and not bringing
Yes.
it into the body. And that is really what silica or clear quartz as a remedy is about, is that
Mm,
alchemy of going from like having this brilliant mind and bringing it into form, because it's a mineral queendom in terms of
right.
remedies is very much
Right.
around like the building blocks of the body. So firstly, I just love that. I mean,
Yeah.
probably nobody else is going to get what we're talking about
Yeah.
now, but I just wanted to share that with you.
I love that. Yeah. Well, and I like to add a nuance to that. So one of the things that I do in my work, because we live in an age where, rightly so, and with gratitude, we are
Mm.
beginning to really honor and discuss how disconnected we are from our bodies, right?
Mhm.
That's a beginning to be a very, not beginning, but it's over the last 10-15 years, excuse me, there's been this huge shift of the body, the body, the body, the body, and getting embodied, and bringing it back to and getting out of the head, which I agree with. I wholeheartedly agree with that. However, the interesting thing is that oftentimes logic gets conflated with being in the head. And those two things, and this is just a little subtlety. I want to be clear. I agree with what you're saying. I was very much in my head, but I wasn't logical. Logic, and so like a part of, as a side thing of what it is that I do and what I bring to the table in the work that I do, is I bring a Socratic logic approach to things, right? Which means that we're willing to look at our contradictions and we're willing to dismantle our biases. That's what logic is always trying to encourage. But I didn't want to do that when I was in my head. And we typically don't when we're in head, because we're scrambling to find those things to hold on to. We might have the brilliance, if you will, like you're saying, like of mental astuteness or the intellect to be able to see a problem, right? But not know what to do with it. And when we see a problem, when we don't know what to do with it, we then begin ruminating. That's the in the head part, is the rumination. But what transmutes out of healing rumination is logic.
Yes, and I think I love the articulation of that, because I think that's ultimately what it's almost like the wounding of silica or clear quartz as a remedy kind of heals and alchemizes, is that kind of logical brilliance, and that's what I see as your gift.
I love that. Thank you.
So that's gorgeous, but we've probably lost everybody now.
Hopefully not. Hopefully you're still with us.
So I just wanted to go back into your story and just see where else there was. There's so much you said in that about shame. The other piece that jumped out at me was this piece around the existential crisis, because it appears to me that oftentimes when we're called into this work of like reclaiming our magic, if you want to call it that, is there is some sort of existential crisis, which for me, again, from what I've seen about that, is that's kind of almost like where our gift is. So I don't know if there's anything to speak to around that particularly, but I just thought that was interesting to share. And I guess it kind of goes in with the going into inner child work piece around
I'd agree with that
of reclaiming our gifts and our wounds ultimately.
So the existential crisis, which part of my work has been trying to develop I was going to say methodology, but I'm trying to, I don't really have a system, right? Not necessarily. Like, there's a system. The system that I have in place is a journey that I walk with each individual that is unique. We learn that the system allows for us to learn together what your gift is, if you will, or what your inner stuff is in some way, shape, or form. So that's the system. But that methodology is there, or that system is there to try to bring one close to that crisis, but not have it be something that destroys them. Right. That we are given, that through our process together, that we're given the skill sets necessary to go, oh, I'm in the shit now. I hope that's okay if I use some language, but we're in the stuff. We're in the filth of myself, but I'm okay. Right. As opposed to when we tend to get to existential crisis, it's at the result of just feeling constantly pressured until we're just ready to break. So that's one thing I'll say to that. When it comes to the commonality or the universality of the existential crisis for the healer or just the individual in general, but you're right, it is sort of largely, I think it comes at the threshold as an initiation for the practitioner or the healer that is going to work with someone or people, is that, well, this comes to mind. There's a teaching from Nisargadatta Maharaj. That's a fun name. I always love saying that name. And there's a story where, and I might have shared the story with you, but there's a story where there's a student that comes to him, and the student is sort of berating him and saying, you're this great guru, and there's all the atrocities that are going on in the world. Why can't you do something to save us from that? Right. And so there's this and to be clear, from that narrative, there's this projection of a grandiosity, some fantasy with a ph, an imago of the guru being the savior of saving the world. And one of the things I like to say that because that's a very sort of, on a side tangent, that's a narrative that we've developed, especially in the West, around Christ specifically, is that there's this future somewhere where there's going to be a savior that comes and saves the world in some way, shape, or form. But I always point people back to the fact that even if you're Christian, if you will, and if you really wholeheartedly believe in Jesus, or you believe in a savior just in general, there's never been a savior that saved the world from anything. In the history of all spirituality, there's never been someone who's come down and saved us from suffering, period, ever. So that's that. But so then this Arganata says to the savior, or says to the student, he goes, I tell you what, there's a lot I could say to all that, but what I'll first say is, if you want to save the world, you got to first save it from yourself. And that's what the initiation of the existential crisis is that we tend to project onto the world our totality of unmet needs and what we imagine our wholeness and our completion and our own salvation to be. And it's all made up. And it's usually made up of lots of systemic conditioning and programming, of indoctrination into like, what's the thing that's going to make your life better, and take this pill and have all this money, and here's the picket fence and all the things, and marriage and kids and all the stuff. If you have those things, then you will have a complete and happy and healthy life. But that never is true. I've never worked with anybody who's had lots of money or has all the things and comes to me and goes, my life's perfect. Right? It's not a thing, right? And so we all reach those existential crises as a result of the deterioration of fantasy and in our lives. And so yeah, we have to go through that process as an initiation if we are destined to be healers. So I think it's just necessary for the process, because something has to die. So yeah.
I love so much what you said in there. I think it'd be good to start with the idea of this quick fix, because I think so many women arrive at this path feeling this sense of like, well, they've tried everything ultimately. So they're probably in that crisis that we're talking about. And they're like, okay, I've landed here. Yeah, I've landed here. I think I'm called to magic. There's this weird thing that's calling me. And like nothing's worked. And I think it's helpful to just kind of illuminate that idea of like what we mean by quick fix versus real healing, in essence, is what I hear you're talking about.
I love that it was a really good segue into that too. The quick fix
almost seemed intentional.
right. Yeah, well done. Look at that. There's a lot to say about the quick fix, and I'm going to try to, like, again, succinctly build a foundation for at least how I approach that notion. There's, as I just sort of described, right, where there's, we're all deeply sort of indoctrinated into this system of conditioning and programming about, well, again, if you get married, everything's going to be better. If you have the kids, if you have a lot of money, everything's going to be better. If you take this pill, everything's going to be better. Excuse me. If you, and especially in today's day and age, with the boom of coaching and personal development and the self-help and all that stuff, that on that note, actually, I want to add another addendum to that. There's also the deep systemic conditioning of individualism, and I'm going to put a pin in that, but I want to add that to this whole formula.
Amazing.
In a nutshell, there's a whole system, again, of indoctrination that is constantly saying, within that same system are narratives and ideas and concepts that develop that are what we call sublimations. And a sublimation is sort of a socially appropriate for the time defense against unknown. So what I mean by that is, so like, we don't, like, the system, like we in our system, in the system that we live in now, we don't know what the answer is really to like our happiness and our joy. We don't really know what it is, but we know we're seeking it. And then so we try to come up with formulas or ideas or, again, concepts or whatever, pills, whatever it is, that help us get that. But all of those are typically designed within that same system of discord and dysfunction with reality, right?
Mm.
This fantasy, this grand, in Vedanta, that's called Maya, right? This grand illusion of life that's why I use the word fantasy so much. I think that's sort of the Western correlation to that. So yeah, there's this deep indoctrination of, well, we know we're not there and we want something, but how do we do that? And typically that system is also going, well, we're living in scarcity, we only have a certain amount of time on this earth. What's the quick fix? What's the thing that's going to get us the quickest within that system to some sense of happiness? Well, again, I bet it won't be all the answers, but if you have enough money, it'll probably help a lot. And it probably won't answer all the things, but if you have the wife or the husband or the child or whatever, it maybe will give you some answers. It maybe will help you feel like you have some sort of completion in your life. And or maybe you go to a self-help guru or whatever, and they're going, in 6 weeks I'm going to give you all the answers or whatever it is, right? And all of those are developed within that same system of conditioning and programming that we've developed unconsciously, I think, largely. And as a result of that, the quick fix is always going to lead us to just a wall, because it's just made up solutions for problems we don't really know how to handle. We don't really have anything that says this is the reality of the problem. Not in pop culture. We do have that knowledge in the deep sort of esoteric realms of things, but people don't really. And this is another reason why I encourage like academia and scholarship and critical thinking and those sort of things,
Mm.
because so much of our uh mundane existence is constantly, and it's because of scarcity, because of individualism, because of these systems of conditioning and programming, it's constantly just sort of layer and layer and layer. How do we sort of make our life easier?
Mm.
And the thing about spirituality is that it's never ever been taught to be easy, ever. Right? Or even self-knowledge, right? Just whether it's spirituality, just self-knowledge in general has never been. I mean, I'll go back to Jesus again. Like one of the great esoteric teachings in the New Testament is, if you want to be my disciple, to follow me, drop everything and bear up your cross. Essentially being like, get ready to be crucified. If you want to know me,
Mm.
be ready to die, right? It's
Mm.
not easy. It's never been taught to be easy, but in our society, we're constantly trying to say that we're, and actually, this is another subtle point I'll share with this, is that through that process, that the process of living in that system of conditioning and programming, we are constantly feeling belittled. We are constantly feeling not worthy enough. We are constantly feeling like we don't have a purpose. We are constantly feeling small and insignificant. And so when we are called to some sort of healing path, we don't really know, but again, it's rare that we really get the skill sets or the tools to know how to do that. But we feel called to it, and it's something that gives us oh, my purpose is maybe there. So we quickly want to get there to feel like we belong,
Mm.
to feel like we really have an answer to ourselves. But that's just another sort of delusion that we give ourselves. And I say that lovingly. I've done it. We all do it, right? It's not a judgment and it's not a wrongness. It's a kind of to be expected, considering the system that we are kind of growing up in, if you will.
Mm.
But that's just sort of an empirical reality of the nature of the systems that we live in, is that because of those systems, when we feel a great calling towards something, we're looking for the quick fix so that we can feel like we can stand on something in a world where we feel belittled and made to feel small on a regular basis. And so that, I think, that in a nutshell is the best way that I can do without giving like a whole lecture on the topic, is why quick fixes are sort of the messy things that they are, because they're not, one, they're mostly entirely made up, and two, we're projecting into those quick fixes the desire to not feel small anymore, which is
Mm.
completely understandable. But in the result of doing that, we typically lose ourselves, as and
Mm.
it doesn't really land us on solid ground. It doesn't, not really. So anyways,
Mm.
yeah.
I'm just chuckling. I remember when we first started to work together, and you were kind of like, "Oh, it's all made up." I'd been in like this three principles bubble like years ago. It's like, hang
Yeah,
on a minute,
yeah.
that's so it's all made up, and then it doesn't matter. And then I remember being like, well, I'm just not going to speak again then. So I'm like
That's
envisaging all the secret witches at home being like, well, what's the point in any of it?
yeah, yeah. No, well, and and that's, again, so that's actually that when you say that, that's actually a really good. When I was talking before about leading someone gently towards the existential crisis, right?
Mm,
And being in their corner, right? To be a facilitator of that in some way. That's what I'm talking, because if I'm saying something like that and your question to it is, what's the point? Well, now we're getting into initiation, right?
mm,
Now we're getting into that place where something is really ready to change. And the hope is you have someone in your corner that can walk you through that change, right? So,
mm.
yeah, anyways, but yeah,
I love
I can
that.
also empathize with the what's the point. So, yeah.
All the witches are listening, go, and they're also probably triggered by, talk of religion.
Right. Yeah, that's
It's a
fair.
very triggering episode.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so what I would love to know then is what's real healing?
Right. Oh, yes. The real healing.
Mm,
Well, first, the word real, I want to say this real quick. The word
mm,
real is a little bit problematic, right?
yes.
Because, and talking about this, I think is helpful to establish sort of what is really real.
Mm, mhm,
But so yeah. So the concept of real is problematic because it's a bit of an imago. And what I mean by imago is an image,
mm.
right? So it's Latin. I think it's Latin. It's either Greek or Latin. You think I know this after I use the word on a regular basis, but sometimes I forget things. But yeah, the imago it means image. When I say imago, what I mean more specifically is an imago Dei, which means an image of God.
Mhm,
Okay. So the imago Dei, Dei being God. And that imago Dei is a fantasy of deity. It's a fantasy. It's a made up thing. So real, right? Like when you go, oh,
mhm,
what's the real thing? Or like when we talk about authenticity, what's the authentic thing? What's your authentic thing? The truth of it is nobody knows. Like not very few people know what those things are
mm,
because we if that was if more people knew what it was, then we would have a very different world we were living in, I think, for a large
mm,
degree. And so I think that's important to just point out is that the
mm,
concept of what's real healing or what's true healing or it can get dogmatic, it
mm,
can get rigid, and so I think it's important to be mindful of that because, as I was saying before, the reality of healing is that it's always, while there's universalities, it's always individual. That's the beauty
mm,
of the individual psyche being developed the way that it is that each individual has its own way that is a
mm,
part of that totality, right?
mm,
One of the great things that I constantly am promoting is this concept of unity through diversity, right? Is that we like the whole nature of existence is infinitely diverse. That's how it was made, that we could say that's how God or source or the life or whatever created existence is infinitely diverse. Yet we as humans are constantly trying to say, what's the one way?
mm,
And I'll quote Daniel Quinn, which is that there is no one right way to live. So when it comes to the real thing or the real healing or true healing, I just want to, illustrating all of that we want to be mindful of that word real because that creates its own
mm.
problems and dogmas.
I love
But
that.
when
I
it
think
comes,
also what you said earlier around, much of what we're talking about is the quick fixes, kind of like the self-helpy pieces and things like that. You're also
yes,
saying, there is a benefit to being in those to a degree in that they
oh,
create some
absolutely.
spaciousness. I think that's also just good to presence because I know we talked about that before we jumped in as
Yes,
well.
before we yeah. No, I appreciate you bringing it because it is really important. It's this thing like with that when it comes to healing, there's all these different modalities that, well, I don't care if it's like astrology or paganism or homeopathy or any, like, I don't, if that's your
Mm,
thing, do it, right?
mm,
And especially like if I'm working with somebody on my corner, like I'm going to do the best I can to support that person through that journey because there's something deeply important, symbolically, archetypally important
mm,
in the thing that you're called to. Again, whatever the modality is, you're called to that for some reason. There's something
mhm,
symbolically important in that doing that is a
mm,
part of your healing journey. And so 100%. And it does, it's sort of like a balm or a therapy that allows
mm,
for you to create that spaciousness in your life so you can breathe and you can feel like the pressure is not so much. And so yes,
And
100%.
what I'm
Okay.
hearing in you say, or in what you say there, is there's
Yeah,
kind of, it's almost like the way we interact with that as well.
it is. So what a big part of, so yeah, like there's a the way that I typically approach, or that I try to approach, or I encourage any practitioner to approach anybody that they're working with, is to acknowledge those things, right? Like, whether it is, again, is astrology or whatever, right? There's whatever the thing is that that person feels called to, that they feel immersed in, that it feels like that's something that is soothing for them. Within that, whatever that also has become an imago Dei of some sort. It has
Mm,
become an image or a vessel by which we can project all of our hopes and dreams into.
mm,
So that means that symbolic, like the archetypal resonance of, again, astrology or whatever, is symbolically representational of what they think their total wholeness is going to be.
mm,
And so so it's 100% useful and important and essential and foundational for an individual to have something like that so that they can project all those unmet needs into. And while they're going through that process, on my end, what I do is I have a process of analysis, which is, we're talking like, oh, you like this? That's interesting. Why? When you say that you like this thing, what is it about it that you like? Oh, that's interesting. I wonder where that came from. When was the first time you remember that? And we go through the whole process, and then eventually you find out that the reason that they like astrology is because their mom or dad treated them a certain way in some way, shape, or form, or an aunt, uncle, or something like that, or society, and it created this wound. And they said, well, if I had this, then I would have this,
mm,
right? And that helps us. It's like a blueprint almost, all the way back to a wound. And so it's absolutely 100% essential to have those things. And then as a self process of learning, either A, like you have somebody in your corner to help you with that, or B, you learn the skill sets necessary to, you know, look at your, like we were saying before, I think before we got on the conversation, or right at the beginning of the
mm,
conversation, where we're willing and able and have the skill sets necessary to look at our biases, to
mm,
look at where they're being confirmed, right? To critically think and to really sort of lovingly, not as like, oh, that's not true and this is not right, and like, but more of like, oh, that's interesting. I loved how I felt there when I did A, B, or C, when I did a chart, or if I, gave this remedy to somebody or whatever it is. I felt really good when I did that. I wonder why I felt good when I did that.
mm,
Right? I wonder what the medicine is in that for me. What's in there for me when I did this thing? Because and whenever, another thing too about the critical sort of analysis of thing is recognizing that when, and I promise I'm getting to like what's real healing look like in a second. Um, when uh, when we have that good feeling, there's an unmet need that has been met. That's great.
mm,
But that's literally in that moment when it feels good or it feels sad. Typically, we think about it more when we're sad or upset. But when it's good, we tend to go, oh, that felt good. It's almost like a drug hit. And then we go do another thing. We don't think about it anymore. But the
mm,
encouragement of analysis and logic is to go, but I've just had like, when I feel good, I've probably had a bias confirmed. What is that? Right. And lovingly, not to be like, oh, that's wrong again, but like that's information about depth within myself. And I'm going to go journey and have an intimacy with myself there, as opposed to just
mm,
allowing it to be a drug that made me feel good. And then I'm going to go watch some TV or whatever it is that I'm going to do for the rest of the day. So that's that. So, when it comes to healing, a lot of what I've said out loud here is sort of like that. It's the healing journey, one, and I say this to everybody that I work with, and I think I've said this to you,
mm,
is buckle in. It's
mm,
not right. It's not something that is you're going to feel healed in a year or two or 5 or 10. You're going to
mm,
have moments where you feel healed, right? And as I was talking, I'll share this story with your audience. As we were getting on the call, I'm talking about with Nicole, that I'm going through a process of buying some land and I'm building a retreat and all this stuff. But this first time I'm actually buying, and so um there's a lot of things that nobody tells you, and when I'm like, as I'm buying and going through the sort of the stressors of buying and all the newest of that, I'm getting to come into contact with things that I have lovingly been able to like put aside and not have to look at for a while, right? And so there's going to be these moments where you have this feeling of like, God, I feel like I've really got my life together and feel things feel good and I feel happy. And because typically for myself, when somebody, asks me how I'm doing, I'm like, I'm always good. And I'm most of the time, I always feel good. That wasn't always the case. But that in a way is my healing has been like also analogous to I have carved out enough space in my life where I feel good all the time. That doesn't mean the shit isn't still there, right? It's just somewhere else because we're talking about an infinitude of an individual, like the infiniteness of one person. It's like you don't really get to have access to that all at once. And so we have to take it in chunks, right? And so anyway, so the healing journey is a lifetime journey. You're going to carve out spaces where you're going to find someplace to land, and it feels really good to be there. And that's great. And we wholeheartedly encourage that. But then the next thing to do after you got it is like realize the work isn't done. You've just got a safe place to land for a little while. And that's awesome. But then there's still work to likely be done after that, 100%. And so it's a constant process of checks and balances, of realizing that we've gotten to a place, right? We've worked on accessing materials, we've worked on our fantasy making, we are, et cetera, and we're going through a process of loving analysis. And I emphasize the loving part, where it's a gentle, graceful, loving analysis of ourselves, a logical approach, not at the ruminating part where we're worrying and anxiety-driven thought processes. We're going through it as like scientist almost, where it's like, oh, that's interesting data. What is that about myself? Because in that, another way to frame it actually is to be lovingly curious and intimate with yourself, right? Is to say, to get away from like the scientific terms, because I tend to lean there, is the softer way of looking at it is how can I be intimate with myself? How can I be lovingly curious about myself and not just say, well, I did this thing that made me feel good and that's the end of the story. I did this thing and made me feel good. Why did it make me feel good? I want to get to know myself there too, right? And that's I think in a nutshell, that's what healing looks like. And I'll say this as a final piece to that. And I know this might be problematic for anybody who listens to this, but I can be controversial that way, so I'll say it out loud. I don't think you get to decide when you heal. I don't think that's up to us. I think our journey, and I recognize, again, that might be pushing back against a lot of individualism and other stuff, but that's the way it is. I don't think there's any data, there's any empirical evidence that says we get to have a choice on when we heal or when we're completely whole. We don't get a say in that. More so, it's we do get a say in saying how dedicated and devoted to knowing ourselves we want to be. And then we have to trust that process. Yeah. And yeah. And so that's the last thing I'll say to that. And that's my summation of healing.
I love that. I love all the little different places that took us, that conversation.
Yeah.
There was so much gold in that. Yeah, my takeaways list is going to be huge. What I'm hearing in that is loving self-illumination is the way I would describe what you're speaking to there.
I like that.
But one of the things that stood out to me that I think would be really helpful to, again, maybe dive into a little bit is that I think a lot of people can hear the word projection and make it wrong. It's like, oh, we're projecting, therefore we're wrong. And what I was really feeling like nourished by what you said there was like, oh, I'm projecting. That's really curious. Like, what's going on there? Like, and that feels really healing for many women who will be listening. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that. And I'm wondering whether it ties into this fantasy piece and whether you can talk more about fantasy.
Yeah, I love that you picked up on that. It's great. Yeah, we do. And this is as sort of as a disclaimer, me sort of being an activist in this way. I will also say that this is why I think it's so important that we as a society do our due diligence to learn how to be scholars, to learn how to learn, because a lot of what I'm seeing in our society, especially today, and especially through anti-intellectualism, is that an anti-academia, anti-science, all this sort of language around is that we hear terms that we go, oh, that's juicy, that feels good. And then we kind of do a little digging. We find like whether it's shadow work or projection or whatever it is, we do a little bit of digging and then we think we're an expert on the damn topic. And that's there's so much, like it's like shadow work, for example, or like the shadow itself. that's become a very popular thing, which I know we wanted to talk about in a second, and this would be maybe a thing we can come back to. But like that topic itself, it's become very popular. But the reality of it is that the guy who coined that is Carl Jung, and because, as I said earlier on, he's not easy to read, right? And I can tell you for a fact that most people who talk about shadow or the shadow work don't know what they're talking about, because you could tell they've never read Jung, or they've read a little bit of Jung and think they have an idea what that is, or whatever it is. And so there's like been this appropriation of terms, and one of those is projection, right? And projection has become the big bad. Well, I think you're projecting here, or you're projecting onto me, or whatever it is. The minute you say, I think you're projecting onto me, just to be clear, you're projecting. Okay. What projection is in a nutshell, it's a micro fantasy of an unmet need. Okay. There's like, for example, expectation. I think we've talked about expectation is a projection. It's a fantasy. Expectation is the hope, and it's like an unwritten contract, as I like to call it. It's the expectation is going, but shouldn't you? Right? Shouldn't you do something? That's a projection, right? And because in that should is a subtle shame, right? It's a shame of like, well, shouldn't you? Because if you don't, you're a horrible person, right? Or something to that effect, right? So projections are, again, micro fantasies of unmet needs. And that's why they're beautiful. Because that micro fantasy of an unmet need is the wounded inner child hoping for something to be like, for it to be held in some way, shape, or form. That wounded inner child through that projection is going, is this the person I want to spend the rest of my life with? Right. That's a fantasy. That's a hope. And I'm not saying it's wrong or bad, not in any way, shape, or form, but it's a hope and a dream of completion and wholeness. And that's tender, and it's vulnerable, and it's understandable. So it's really beautiful. A projection is really beautiful and loving in that way, but it's messy, and it's a distortion of reality at the same time. So it's not good or bad. It's a very tender thing. It's like a child trying to figure out what life should be like, projecting onto it. Oh, I hope this carrot tastes good, or this piece of broccoli tastes good. And they take it and they, oh, that tastes horrible. It's sort of like that. Or if I'm going to play with this toy and I hope it feels good in my hands, or whatever it is, and then it's not, and they throw it away. It's sort of the same thing. It's a very childlike approach. All projection is a childlike approach to reality. And I think that's why it's very important to understand that projection is not a bad thing. Is it messy? Yes. But it's not a bad thing. It's just a childlike way that we approach reality. Yes.
I love that so much. It feels so healing for so many women who may have just kind of, again, innocently projected that projection is wrong.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So what I would love to speak to then is, I guess, like, how does inner child work really work? And the shadow work piece that you mentioned.
Sure. Yeah. So the way that I approach both those things is very Jungian in its own right. And I would say it's a sort of an evolution of Jung's work. I think if Jung had another 20 years, I feel like, well, I might be I'm about to say this out loud, and it might sound very egotistical. I'm going to say it anyways, because I still think it's empirically true, but I think it probably would have gotten to a version of what I'm about to say here, which is that, because, and I'll preface this with, because Jung was very immersed in alchemy, traditional alchemy, Western alchemy, and the esoteric things, Gnosticism, Kabbalah. He even studied some Vedanta concepts like Kundalini, etc. And so, I'll stick with alchemy. From an alchemical perspective, at the core of all the work that we're doing in alchemy and traditional Western alchemy is to birth the divine child. That's the goal. That's the stone. That's the philosopher's stone that is being looked for, is to birth the divine child, the thing that is right, that is immovable, that is a constant, that is the isness of reality. That's the divine child. And so within all of our psyches, we all have an embryonic version of that divine child. Okay. So when we're born on a psychological level, you know, we think that the physical form of the child is the child, right?
Mm.
But really it's a psychological structure. It's something that we were born with sort of psychospiritually, is this internal child. That is this embryonic, phase of our own psycho-spiritual journey that is wanting and ready to be developed into a born child psychologically. So like there's a lot, like for example in Alchemy and Jung's psychological work, he'll talk about that most of humanity, most of a person throughout all their life is really in an embryonic state psychologically, meaning that the child hasn't been born yet. And so that's like an anchor or a precursor to what I'm about to say, because what then happens is there's a child psychologically that is born into those same systems of indoctrination and control and conditioning and programming that I was talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And all those systems are trying to tell you how you're supposed to be. We don't
Mm-hmm.
do this. You shouldn't have done that. This, like, and really as a child, you're just going, I like this glass. I want to touch this glass. I'm going to put this glass in my mouth. And you're just very curious. You're unbridledly curious about things. I'm like, one of my the stories that I use often is because my twin boys did this. They would get crayons and they would look at the crayons when they were toddlers and they're like, oh, I'm going to color on the wall. Right. They don't know about money or like damage or property damage. They don't have any of those sort of concepts. They're just being lovingly curious about what happens when you do a thing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But then we come in, and I certainly did this with my children at the time, which is like, you don't have to clean that up and don't do that. We don't do that with crayons. And now I've got to paint it and all the things. And all my scarcity our scarcity will show up. I don't have enough time for this. And so a lot of how we as parents are informing our children are coming from our own woundedness, our own fears, our own anxieties, et cetera, et cetera. And so we are in a way indoctrinating the child into our fears and try to
Mm.
make our lives easier by indoctrinating them to what we think they should be for us, right? Or the unlived life, right? So
Mm.
that starts creating this fragmentation of identity for the child, right? And so that child is going, well, I can't do that. I don't know why I couldn't do that. I know my parent just said a whole bunch of things to me, but there are a whole bunch of adult concepts that I have no idea about, right? And but I know it was wrong because that was the impression that I got, and so I just won't do it. But we don't have any answers there. We don't. We and in that moment we fragment some sense of authentic expression
Mm-hmm.
and suppress it into psychologically in some void realm of somewhere, and then go, well, then I will at some point. Obviously that doesn't happen overnight with children, right? But
Mm.
at some point we go, that's the way it's done. We
Mm.
don't know why it's the way it's done, but we just know it's the way it's done because mom and dad or society or authority or whatever said so. And all of that is fragmentations. Now you think about all the micro sort of moments when that happens, right? Where it's
Mm.
like that means sometimes that might happen 20 times in a day,
Mhm.
right? And maybe if it's happening on an average of 20 times, I really don't know. I'm just throwing out some numbers, but let's say it happens it might even happen more than that. But let's say it happens 20 times a day for the entirety of your childhood, every single
Mm.
day. Those are a lot of little micro fragmentations of identity, of authentic expression that eventually get buried under the fantasy of who you should be for them,
Mm.
right? And that psychological content goes somewhere. It has to. It doesn't just
Mm.
go off into the ethers and disappear. It goes somewhere and it's stored. And this is where we're getting into like the subconscious and unconscious realms. It gets stored in that subconscious predominantly. I'm of the mindset that the subconscious is I call the subconscious what Jung called the personal unconscious. So there's a collective unconscious and there's a personal unconscious.
Mhm.
And that personal unconscious is the subconscious. And a lot of that content goes into the subconscious realm. And that subconscious content eventually turns into the wounded child, I think.
Mm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Because all that subconscious content largely is composed of is the things you didn't get to do, your unlived life.
Mm.
Right. And so in that, when it comes to inner child work, there's this subconscious realm within our psyches that is all the things that you didn't get to do, and you don't know why you didn't get to do them to a large degree, or maybe you rationalized it through the conditioning that was given to you. Well, we just don't do it that way because we are such and such, or we are, like in America, which is we are Americans, we do these things and we like guns and bombs and stuff. Like that's just a part of like the society, the cultural conditioning that you get, and that's why we do things the way we do, right? But all that's just made up. Again, it's just made up things that are trying to help us feel like we belong somewhere. And at the core of all of that was an authentic expression that was somehow stifled because of that conditioning and programming. And so what remains is the wounded child in our subconscious realms. And so inner child work is about going into that space. It's not about, as it's often commonly referred to in our society and in pop psychology and neo-spiritual sort of concepts of, well, do you want to go play? Go play. Like it's, I mean, yes, that's sort of a part of it. And yes, go play, please. But at the same time, that's not the work of it. It's sort of like a micro part of the work, but it's not the work of it. The work of it is learning how to go into that subconscious realm with your own wounded child and sit with it and learn from its wisdom of the things that it lost, the things that it would have hoped, the things that it was trying to do when it was cut off and that created this fragment, all that depth work. Right. That's what it means to do inner child work. The way at least I approach it, and I think that's the way that Carl Jung would approach it. If he had gotten to that place. And ultimately, to be clear, that is what Jung did. He just wouldn't have called it that. That was just that was analytical psychology, is in a nutshell. Is going in and looking at that stuff and creating an analytical process by which we're collecting data and allowing that data to create a blueprint back to that original wound, which is inner child work. Shadow work. The shadow it's a complicated thing. So there's a lot. The reason I'm trying this is because it's complicated. I'm trying to keep it short and succinct, but I'm trying to figure out where to start. Okay, so with shadow work, how does a shadow get created? Right? There's some sort of structure in the way of light, right, beaming in a certain direction. And the object, the light gets projected onto the object, and then on the other side of the object, a shadow is created, right? Okay. Now, shadow work, and this is why I teach very strongly that sort of the inner child work comes first, and then shadow work comes later. Because let's say I'm trying to give a good analogy. Like, let's say you're facing the sun. Right? You're looking at the sun. Well, don't look at it too long, but let's say you're looking in the direction of the sun, right? And you've got the light beaming down on you. And behind you is your shadow. You can't see your shadow, nor can you see your own back. There's a lot of things about our own physical bodies that we can't see, right? So there's a way to say that is that it's completely unconscious. We don't know anything about what's going on behind us, what we can't view, what we can't see. But we know from an outside perspective, if we're witnessing the person looking at the sun, that behind them is a shadow that is cast, right? In a way, shadow work is learning how to come into contact with your shadow that's behind you that you can't see, which is completely unconscious. Okay. But it's cast as the result of the very solid object of you. Okay. Shadow work, another way to put this is, or to make this in a I can't think of the word right now, but yeah, another way to frame shadow work is recognizing what is collectively unconscious within you, which is not something that a wounded child can do. Right? A lot of this work is sort of loosely based on the hero's journey. And in the hero's journey, sort of universally, there's a few themes. One of those themes is that typically there's not a father figure in the initial part of the hero's journey. There's a mother, which we typically would consider sort of the devouring mother, which is the mother that doesn't want the child to grow up. And then there is the individual who is ready to become the hero, and they go off on their heroic journey, right? And they kind of have to pull away from mother, right? And they have to do all these things. But through the journey of becoming the hero, they don't go straight to the dragon to
Mm-hmm.
slay it, right? They have to go through a number of trials and tribulations to be able to become robust, prepared, strong enough to face that large monster at the end of the journey, right? And to win the prize. That's the same thing on this sort of inner child shadow work journey, which is that we have to go through a process by which our child can break away from the devouring mother, which in this, or the devouring father, depending on but in this case is conditioning, programming, and society's expectations of you, to break away from that, to stop it from devouring you, and to go off into the hero's journey and learn how to be the hero, right? And
I love
then
that.
you get to do shadow work. So it's this process of how does the child mature and become solid and whole and able to face and confront the big, dark, deep thing within themselves, the monster within themselves. And then you get to do shadow work. Then the dragon comes. And so, and in that case, the shadow or the shadow work in this context is coming into contact with the behemoth or the leviathan of the collective unconscious, which is the totality of all conditioning and programming ever created. And that's a child's not ever ready to do that.
I love
So
that. I love
yeah.
that. Yeah. I was just wondering where what came to mind as you were speaking. It was like there's a lot of kind of interest in ancestral healing, and I'm wondering where you see all that fits in with what you're just sharing there.
I typically,
Or is that too big of a
no, no.
that's your question that's like a whole new
Yeah,
episode?
no, I actually love because it's something I've wanted to talk about, but I don't think I've actually really ever been able to talk about publicly. I think I maybe have said it in some session stuff, but the way that I look at ancestral work, quote unquote, is sort of, it's twofold. One of the reasons it's twofold: inner child work and shadow work, right? I will say that every time that I hear anybody talk about inner or ancestral work, I tend to hear inner child work, right? And it's unconscious. And so, it's because here's the thing: it's the same thing. Like, I have this other saying: you can't let go of what you don't know you're holding on to, right? Like, if you don't know you're holding on to something, you're like, it's like, like sort of the thing, like sometimes, like, I'm getting to that age where I'll have my glasses off or down, or they'll be on my face, and I'll be like, I don't know where my glasses are, and they're like, oh, they're on my face, and then like, I forgot. It's sort of similar to that. If we don't know that the thing is there, we don't know that we have it, or we need to let go of it, or we need to do anything with it. And so similarly to that, and acknowledging what I said before about, feeling small and insignificant in the world and all those things, and then wanting to feel like we belong in some way, shape, or form, and typically we will create some sort of grandiosity as a result of that. I think ancestral work is one of those things. And again, I think that's the same for astrology or anything else. And again, I don't think it's wrong. But what tends to be developed through that process is the fantasies of all of our hopes and dreams that somehow we'll find wholeness. But if we don't know what the thing is empirically, tangentially, I don't know, like this glass, I know it's a glass. I can hold on to it because I've examined it. I know what it's made of. I know that's a thing that I know and I'm holding on to, and I can either put it down or I can pick it up. If it's all megged up and it's all fantasy, like if you don't know, like when it comes to ancestral work, like if you don't know the actual empirical objective reality of your ancestors, it's just made up. It's just a feeling, right? And again, that's not wrong, but it's saying more about you than the actual ancestor.
Yeah, I
Right?
think it's almost like in some ways, again, the way that you're describing it, it's like another beautiful lens for our projections.
Yes,
And
100%.
yeah, and what I'm also wondering, because there's a lot of stuff about epigenetics, and in homeopathy we have
Yes.
like miasms and things that essentially
Right.
like diseases physical in our bodies that
Yes.
will be passed down through
Yes.
familial pieces. So it just
Yes.
was quite interesting to me, because I think it's almost like in terms of like what we physically manifest when we look at the kind of physical side of health.
Yes.
I think there's a lot for me that feels quite juicy in the exploration of epigenetics and how it's passed down. And
Agreed.
that leads me into another question, I guess, about projection and manifesting in the body, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Does that make sense as a question, or shall I
Uh,
make it more of a question?
well, I think so. I mean, when it comes to, when I hear that, like the projection of manifesting some, yes. Well, at least how I hear that is, so one of the things that about the ancestral stuff, and like when you're talking about epigenetics or genetics in general, like, you know, epigenetics and genetics sort of being somewhat different, but obviously in the same symbiotic relationship, that both of those are largely collectively unconscious materials, right? So, and that ties in the shadow aspect of things. When, so like, for example, so like the genetic makeup, unless you go and do the genetic work to really know where your genetics come from, and I mean the nuance of that, like you know who your 10th grandfather was, and et cetera, like, and what their physical ailments were, and all that, like, unless you do that, you don't know, period. You just don't. What's happening epigenetically is sort of a what's the word, contact. There's like contact of your environmental subconscious world, right? So what you experienced as a child, the conditioning and programming, the systemic realities of your environment have created an interaction with genetic material and created an epigenetic result, right? And but all of that is happening unconsciously, and largely due to variables that we may likely never come into contact with. So another way to look at sort of ancestral work from that perspective, or like if it's, you know, where is that, are you going to have a physical manifestation of something that happens, like if you're projecting unconsciously into something genetically within yourself, or that there's all of that, I think, like the unconscious material, because it's coming into contact with the environment, the environmental, is creating a chemical mixture by which an organic physiological response occurs. And there are archetypal resonances with that, right? There's sort of universalities with, well, if A and B, it's like if unconscious variable A comes into subconscious variable B, then that produces typically this sort of result. Here's the remedy. But the variables themselves are unconscious. We just know that what we can quantify is the result, right?
Yes.
Right. And so that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I was hearing when you asked the question.
It does.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like we've gone quite deep there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so then I'm wondering, because I know you talked a lot about parts work, and I know that ties in with a lot of archetypal remedy work that we do as well. So I'm just wondering if you can explore a little bit about parts work, and I'm conscious of time as well. So
Oh yeah. Like
so
I said, I've got
I hope
time,
you're
but
all
it's up to
good.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, parts work. Well, as I was saying before we hopped on, like it is one of my favorite sort of inner child work modalities that I like to utilize. And you know, the idea of parts work, as you're, you know, hitting the nail on the head with, is the reality that there is subtle aspects to ourselves, to our own psyche, our subconscious world, that we largely don't have a conscious relationship with. You know, we can sometimes know that we're sad, or that we're angry, or that we're happy. But I actually, and I don't know if this is empirical in the sense of like if there's any data on it, but my experience in working with people over the last one-on-one over the last 5 years, and then, you know, off and on collectively in the residential and counseling treatment programs, is that most people are kind of disconnected from subtle emotions or subtle thoughts and feelings, like really like resentment or grief, or, you know, like it's not uncommon for people to be like, you know, for you to, you know, you having some sort of experience, like, I don't know, it's something that just bothering me. I've had all this stuff going on. And the therapist goes, it sounds like you're grieving. Right. And they just didn't know how to name it. Right. And then they go, oh, that feels right. I guess that is the right word. Right. That kind of stuff happens on a regular basis. And so parts work in ways, and I'm oversimplifying it just a little bit here in this you know, aspect of parts work, but parts work is sort of going, let's go meet grief, right? And get to know grief as a personality within ourselves, because grief it can be a personality. It can have a very, like, not everybody grieves the same way, right? And so there's a unique expression that you've developed of grief or any other emotional response that you can come into contact with. And that's, and parts works helps us to allow us to go and make contact with those aspects of ourselves. The way that
Mm,
I approach parts work is sort of a very long game of parts work, and parts work as an initial sort of thing. Typically there's like a methodology by which you can go and sort of map out
mm,
things. I don't prefer that because I like the unconscious to lead. I like the subconscious to give
mm,
me permission and consent to say, oh, let's name you now, sort of thing. I don't like diving into that, but ultimately the point of parts work is because is that it allows for us to, yes, come into contact with those archetypal resonances of things, or those symbolic resonances of things that are like sadness, grief,
mm,
anger, whatever, happiness, joy. But then it's also other things like protector parts, as they call it in parts work, or managerial parts in parts work. And these are parts that have roles to play in very specific systems, right? And
mm,
ultimately all that leads us to is sort of a blueprint by which we can create a personal relationship with subtle aspects of ourselves that help to make it more intimate and personalized. As I was saying before, at
mm,
the beginning of the show, oftentimes the way that what like in traditional psychotherapy, it's like, well, that's an interesting feeling. Can you tell me more about that?
mm,
And that's a way to approach it, but it keeps us sort of in our head, and it kind of keeps us like sort of outside of the sort of natural unfolding of the feeling to naturally arise as a result of something.
mm,
And parts work says, let's get to know that as an aspect, like a personality within ourselves, and to
mm,
build a relationship with sadness or grief or protection or whatever it is. And that's all very helpful from a subconscious inner child work perspective, because it helps
mm,
us to bring to life in some sort of personalized, relatable way, deeply subconscious material. I think
mm.
that I think that summates parts work, at least at least for a quick plug. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. I'm wondering, I'm just conscious that we have kind of framed this episode around like realizing our magic, and I'm wondering if we can kind of speak to some of the I guess that we have already to a degree, but like some of the fantasies, some of the wounds that we face in the journey of becoming a healer. If there's anything that comes to mind around that.
in correlation to discovering magic.
I guess in correlation to for when women are starting to approach becoming a healer.
Mm. And the wounds that sort of block us from doing that.
Yeah, I guess maybe I could be a bit more specific. So, things like, and there is a question from the group actually on this, but
Okay.
things like some of the common fears that I see come up are things like fear of failure, self-doubt, and particularly fear of judgment. So, I guess if there's anything
Right.
kind of practical around those
Mm.
pieces, it could be helpful to just briefly
Yeah.
explore those.
All of those are shame driven.
Mm,
And so wherever there's shame, well, I have two sayings that I sort of teach. Wherever there's shame, there's dysfunction.
mm,
And I don't mean dysfunction as a bad thing. It's just
mm-hmm,
there's some sort of disconnect between you and your sort of authentic sense of self, if you will.
mm-hmm,
Another way to say it is that wherever there's shame, there's conditioning and programming.
mm-hmm,
So when you're feeling called to some sort of modality, some sort of passion in your life, something that you want to do with yourself, um, and there's especially if we're getting into the more esoteric realms of like
mm-hmm,
using, like, for example, the word magic or
mm-hmm,
witch or any of those things because of societal conditioning and programming, right? there's there's going to be deeply systemic conditioning within yourself that says that somehow that is wrong, that you should not shine bright in some way, you should not take up too much space. I mean, we could also get into like the patriarchy and other things, right?
mm-hmm.
That there's this notion that calling is not allowed to exist.
Mm,
And you can hear that. I mean, you can hear some of the conditioning and what I was like the examples that I was giving other just from parent of you want to color on the wall. Well, we don't do that. And here's all the shameful reasons as why, and we don't know as a child what any of that means. We just know it's wrong according to essentially God, which is our parents at that point in time. And so when it comes to, that calling that you have within yourself and you're feeling sort of guilty or blocked or shame or guilty or block or some sort of narrative that says I shouldn't or shouldn't, but there's some sort of shame in there that has conditioned you into subordination to a larger system that you never consciously agreed to. And when it comes to like dismantling that, I mean, there's a number of different ways. I'm of the mindset, I have a bias and I'll recognize it, but I'm of the mindset that the way to truly dismantle, especially in the West, and this is a larger conversation, that's another topic, but in the West, because the West has a very sort of specific kind of conditioning and programming as opposed to Eastern cultures, that the way to dismantle that shame or whatever is through a process of some sort of analysis of quantifying, kind of like what I was saying before of like, oh, that made me feel good. What's the bias there? Right? What's being confirmed? What makes me feel good? Why? Because on the other end of that is an unmet need, and that unmet need was created through shame and guilt or something like that, right? And so when we get the dopamine or serotonin hit or whatever it is from that felt good, if we trace it back, then we're going to get sourced into a place of wherever that shame and guilt was. And that's through a process of analysis. It's a very specific working backwards towards the causality of why that felt good in the first place or why it felt bad. So like in the case of like, you want to shine brightly in some way, that if you're feeling like, oh, I shouldn't, shine too bright, I don't want to take up too much space or whatever it is, that too muchness is a conditioning. And likewise, you can go, well, why do you feel like you're too much in there? What's wrong with you shining brightly in this moment? What's the threat? What's the fear? And begin a data collection analysis process to work yourself back to, oh, at this point in time, somebody did this and this and this, and it made me, come up with this defense mechanism or whatever it is that, and then like I was saying before, once you get back to that place, because you can't let go of what you don't know you're holding on to, now you know what you were holding on to. You know it empirically. You worked back there through the math of it, right? To the thing, and it all lines up in the equation, and that's the thing. And now, do you want to hold on to it or do you want to let it go? Right. So that, like, as a process piece and the work of things and expressing authentically and all those things, that's going to, like, when it comes to the shame and guilt, that's the thing that I encourage anybody to do, is to go through a loving process of analysis that allows you to work your way back to the thing you're holding on to, and that way you can let it go if you want. So.
That's really powerful. Making the unconscious conscious.
Making the unconscious conscious. Yeah.
Amazing. So there's one Greek question which may be a similar thing, I don't know, but I'm going to read it so that you can answer it.
Okay.
So one woman asked, how do we heal abandonment issues? It's still very much affecting my life at nearly 65 years of age and causing extreme anxiety, especially when feeling vulnerable with health issues that are not easy to heal.
One, my heart goes out to you. There's a lot in that question, actually. I think I would say, well, one, there's always the default, and it makes it hard to kind of answer these questions. Not that they're not. I want to be very clear. Not that they're not worth asking or any of those things, but it makes it hard because I don't know this individual. I don't know the nuance of your story, right? But as a generality, what I'm hearing when you ask that question, it sounds like, when I hear you're 65, you're going through health issues, I get the impression that you feel alone in some way, maybe scared in aloneness, or that there's not a large support group there, maybe, or potentially maybe that the things that you're going through in your life right now are maybe you do have a good support, but nobody really has answers for you. Nobody really has knows what you're going through in a real way and can really be there in an intimate way while you're journeying through whatever it is you're journeying through. And what I hear you saying about the abandonment piece is that the abandonment um, feels heavy. It feels weight. It feels like maybe you're being abandoned on a regular basis because of whatever reason. And the way to, quote unquote, heal that would be, in my, my opinion, is to go through. Well, let ask the question. Like, well, why do you feel abandoned? Well, I feel abandoned because of these. And again, it's this process of analysis of working with someone or with yourself, or at least, I don't know, even journaling to some degree. Why do I feel abandoned? Well, I have these things going on, or I don't have this stuff in my life. I feel neglected. I feel, because the abandonment wound itself is deep within your subconscious. You're not going to be able to get access to that just right away. You might have, as I'm talking and as you're listening, you might have a memory that wants to pop up. You might have an image that wants to pop up. I don't want to be very clear, like, and that might even give you an aha moment of like, oh, this feels something. It feels resonant. It feels good in some way to acknowledge this thing or this memory or this image or whatever it is. But remembering that that wound is deeply unconscious, when we have moments like that where there's some sort of memory or image come up, it's sort of like a dream. It's like you're dreaming a little bit. And so as all dreams are, they're subconscious messages, and they're kind of trying to tell you a story in some way, shape, or form that is symbolically representational of its origin. And I say that because largely the subconscious things are still sort of nonverbal, because usually that fragmentation occurred during early childhood. And so it doesn't really know how to communicate itself clearly, but it can give you images and symbols and those sort of things. So again, I recognize that's a little heady and it's a little complex, but that's why I think when it comes to how do we get to the wound of abandonment, I think it really is a loving process of analysis, of acknowledging the complexity that manifested the abandonment in the first place, and the complexity of how you've managed that abandonment throughout your life. In order to get to that source, we have to go through all of that to get to it. That is just the empirical reality of what that means. In the meantime, however, with your abandonment, whatever, like as a practicum of something to help soften that or open that up, I would say boundaries are probably needed there in some way, shape, or form, of saying, this is good for me, this is not good for me. Begin carving out space in your life that allows you a little breathing room through the hardships that you're going through, so that you feel a little safer and a little less abandoned, right? And I don't know what that looks like. I would need a lot more information, obviously, to get specific on what you would want to do with that. But that would be the place that I would go, is okay, well, where can we put some boundaries in your life so that those boundaries are beginning to carve out space so you can stand up and not feel so little and small, or not seen, not held, not loved. And you can stand up and be like, I got space and I'm okay. I'm taking care of myself. I feel less abandoned as a result of me carving out these boundaries. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
Mm.
that's my response to that. Yeah.
I know the woman who asked this question, and my feeling is that would be really helpful. So thank you for that.
Okay, good.
What stood out to me actually was as you were talking about like almost dreams and symbols, is that often these kind of archetypal ways of working will provide us with that as well. And I know
Absolutely.
this woman had a particular journey with one of her archetypal remedies that was very symbolic as well. So
Oh,
I
good.
loved your answer there.
Good.
And I also feel like it would be that whole exploration will be very serving to all of our listeners who probably have some form of this kind of particular wounding to
Yeah,
love themselves through as well. So
good.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Wow, that feels like a good place to complete. I could probably go on talking to you for hours, but I'm just conscious of that part of your time as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I'm wondering if before we do complete, if there's anything else that feels important to share that you had wanted to share particularly.
There is. Bear with me. I'm formulating the thoughts.
Mm.
Um, it has to do with the journey of being a practitioner and a healer in some way, because I recognize that you said a lot of the audience that is listening today are also practitioners or attempting to be working towards becoming practitioners themselves. And I think it comes down to two things. One, I wholeheartedly, anybody who's wanting to become a practitioner and helping other individuals throughout life, God bless you. You are trying to work. You're doing something very hard, right? Because as I said in the early part of this conversation, most of us don't know what we're doing. We really don't. It's all made up. And it's not all made up, but there's most of it's all made up, right? And so the fact that you're wanting to step out into the world and help it and guide it and love it and nurture it, that's amazing. And I'm so grateful that there are people in the world that want to do that. What it takes, however, on the other end of that is a great level of accountability and responsibility to work with people. And I think it's really important to emphasize that because I am constantly confronted with individuals who have had very poor experiences with other practitioners. And in the sense that there was a lot of expectation, a lot of projection, unconscious things, a lot of systematic, dogmatic approaches to the individual and their journey. A lot of attempts of trying to conform an individual to a certain way of being, which is just more dogma and more systems of conditioning and programming. And what it means to really create a means by which you walk with someone and lovingly help them throughout their lives is dismantling as much as you can your own unmet needs so that you are not projecting all other people, expecting them to be what you need them to be for you, right? For your version of healing or salvation for the world or any of those things. And so you're being asked, as a healer and a practitioner, you're being asked into probably one of the hardest things to ever do in life. And I ask lovingly to take that seriously, not like in the sense of like I have to be serious and regimented about these things, but serious as a level of accountability, loving accountability and responsibility, that you're being asked, like if you have that calling, you are unconsciously being asked by the divine source, whatever you want to call it, to do something massive and lovingly be accountable for that, because you're being asked to walk with people, not objects, not systems, not the fantasies of your unmet needs, but people. And that's really, really important to just be responsible for, lovingly so. And it goes back to the thing of like what Nisargadatta Maharaj said of like, if you want to save the world, you got to first save it from yourself. And because what we're saying there is saying, it's not about you. It's not, right? Your journey, your healing is about you, but what you did to heal is not what other people need to do. It's just not. It might have some commonality. It might have connecting points where you go, oh, I can relate to that. And we can have empathy there. We can have all those things, but it's not about you. It's never about you. And so as you're going through this process, again, I wholeheartedly commend you. It is absolutely amazing that you feel called to do that. Please continue on that journey. 100%. We need those kind of people in the world. And if you're feeling called, then I trust God or source's divine inspiration to call you to it, right? But that also means get ready for the work, please, because in order to do the thing, you have to dismantle all the things within yourself that the other person, you have to come into intimacy with that stuff that the other person's going to be going through. And if you don't have that knowledge, then it's just two blind people walking through the darkness. And that's fine. At least you have someone together to walk through the light. And I commend that. But if it's about going into the light and finding some sort of knowledge, do that work and be responsible, be accountable. That's it. That's my.
That feels so gorgeous to complete on, actually. Because I think, again, it was one of the things I always share is how there's so many like quick fixes to being a healer out there.
Right. Yeah.
And like, again, more projection of like, But yeah, it's so important for me, and it's something I really didn't realize until a few years ago. It's like,
Right. Yeah. And well,
oh, okay.
likewise. Yeah, I can relate to when I first did this stuff one-on-one, I would not have said the same stuff I just said, right?
Mm,
Like so like it's something I've learned. And I think that actually I was going to say this too, is that actually this might be as practitioners, I like Carl Jung said this. I frequent Carl Jung today, but Carl Jung has this thing. He says, learn all the theories, read all the books, learn all the skills, but when it comes to being with another human, just be another human, right?
mm,
And
yeah.
so what I love about that is, and I try to emulate that in my own life. I think I am relatively successful at that, but I don't always succeed at that. But there's when it comes to working with another person as a practitioner, is be a human being with just another human being. You can have all, I often say, and I think I've said this to you, Nicole, is like I have a toolbox of a whole bunch of stuff. I've got
Mm.
certifications out the wazoo about things that I've learned to do. I don't hardly ever use them. I just know them. I have an intimacy with them. And sometimes I pull them out. You say, you know what, this practice might be cool, right? But
Mm.
other than that, it's just there. And I don't have to, I'm not trying to fit you into the toolbox.
Mhm.
I just pull out the tools if I need them, right?
Mm.
Otherwise, it's just us chatting. And on top of that, and this is the actual point that I was trying to get to, is that initially I tried to have systems in place. I was like, well, let's do this modality. Let's do this thing. This is my way of doing things. And the more and more that I kept working with people, it really was just like, you know what? I'm just going to hang out with these people and get to know them and learn, right? What is the thing? And let the unconscious lead. And through that process, I came into an intimacy. I call her the mother. I think the unconscious is the mother of like all psyche. And so I learned to listen to mom and let her
Mm.
lead me, right, in this process. And I encourage, I think all practitioners sort of, sort of generally need to work in that direction in your specific way, but your general, and let the person you're talking to lead you through their own
Mm.
unconscious to the knowledge that you're trying to discover in that session, right? That there's no formula, there's no methodology, there's no modality that's ever going to always get you there. It's just about let's be humans with each other and love each other through that process, and the unconscious will lead us.
Mm.
So it'll always teach you. It'll always show you what you need to find if you just listen. So yeah.
Mm. Mm. Gorgeous. Thank you so much. Where can people find out about you? And we'll include this in the show notes as well.
Yeah. I'm not, I've moved away from social media for the most part. I am posting, I'm writing again. I'm writing on Medium. And I'll post my things on Facebook. So you can find me on Facebook, kind of. I'm not really active there, but I'll post my Medium links and all that stuff there. And then, with regards to my actual work, I have a website. It's called Aion, psychodynamiccoaching.com. I know that's a mouthful. So excuse me, that's AION, psychodynamic coaching, which you can look up psychodynamic coaching .com, and you can find my website there. And sort of a brief, it's under construction still. It's got most of sort of the foundational stuff that I want there, but it gives you a good insight as to sort of how I approach things and all that good stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. And I'll put that all in the show notes as well. But
Okay,
thank you
thank you.
so much for being a magical guest.
Thank you, Nicole, for having me. I really appreciate it. It was lovely to have this conversation.
I loved it.
This episode went very deep and I loved it personally. Here are my takeaways. Our biggest wounding comes from the unlived life of our parents, which leaves us with unmet needs that become our wounds, and this can be healed with true inner child work. The challenge is much inner child work is often related to from a place of quick fix projection and fantasy by modern coaching and self-help industries. Ideas of go play with your little girl, embodiment practices, which are helpful in some ways, but often lack the depth of real healing. Caveating that real is our own projection too, William explores that how he sees the real journey of healing is grounded in a lifelong journey of understanding our biases, projections and conditionings, our fantasies, with loving, curious self-illumination, which some could call the deep work. Projection is not a bad thing. We have projected onto projection if we think it is. And it's a great thing to get curious about. We're even projecting things that we deem to feel good because that reveals where we have met an unmet need. And as aspiring healer witches, we have been called to no easy task. The work of healing ourselves isn't easy and is ongoing. And as healers, we also have a responsibility for accountability, self-awareness, and avoiding projection of our unmet needs onto our clients. That's why the healing work is so important for ourselves. Common fears of becoming a healer, including fear of failure, self-doubt, and fear of being judged and abandoned, are rooted in shame and can be healed through deep, loving self-illumination. Inner child work, parts work, shadow work, and ancestral healing are all serving to help us reclaim our magic, ultimately all offering us a way of deepening intimacy with ourselves. If you'd like to get the show notes and links for everything we've chatted about in this episode, head to www.secretwitch.co.uk. If you know a secret witch who would love this episode, please share with them to help them liberate themselves. And so you don't miss out on next week's episode, head to your podcast app of choice and hit subscribe. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.